Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I like to discuss the messages that Dominic Cummings dropped yesterday. The more interesting element, but really, whether he knows what he's doing in terms of the releases and the timing of the release. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So yesterday morning, Dominic Cummings started to tweet a short series of messages to back up his earlier claims at the parliamentary hearing in May. Because at the time, he was accused of saying things without really providing the evidence. What they wanted was not his word. He's not, after all, a credible witness. It's the documentary evidence. And this includes, it's a famous one now, where Boris Johnson said to Cummings that the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, was totally effing hopeless. Now, Ian Blackford for the SNP brought this one up in Prime Minister's Questions, though he only did it as a little dig. He didn't really ask it as a primary question, so it was easily deflected by Johnson. His questions were mostly about the Australia trade deal, which I'll be getting onto tomorrow. So there's a lot to unpack there. But the timing of these messages from Cummings is what initially intrigued me, more than the messages themselves. Because I can't tell if he is totally effing useless or actually knows what he's doing. Because in terms of the extremes of opinion about Dominic Cummings, my own is that, like Boris Johnson, he's not a political genius, right? But nor is he a cretinous chancer. There are somewhere in between. For example, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister and he relied heavily upon Dominic Cummings for his political strategy, Cummings based everything on the notion that the opposition would mess up and agree to a general election. Boris Johnson was getting nowhere. Defeat after defeat after defeat. The talk was of him being the shortest serving Prime Minister in history. That was absolutely on the cards. That was what was going to happen. But then the opposition did give them that general election. But that was their stupidity. It wasn't Cummings' genius. He didn't trap them into doing it with some brilliant wheeze. He just got lucky that they lost their minds. But nor is he an imbecile. He did outplay a lot of people during both 2016 and 2020, albeit ultimately losing out to a play from Johnson's then fiancée, now wife, late last year. So what do I think about the timing of what are undoubtedly damaging messages? Well, I think about the chronology on this. So we knew that Cummings was going to be attending this parliamentary hearing weeks before it happened. He would have known beforehand, of course. He will have planned it well in advance. Why didn't he have the messages ready for that hearing? He must have known that he's not a credible witness, unless his conceit really knows no bounds. Did he really think he was going to go there and be believed? How does that make sense? He's going to a committee which is largely comprised of Conservative MPs to say that the Conservative government made a complete shambles of things and they should listen to him, a guy who constantly attacks the Conservative Party and Conservative MPs and yet wants to be employed by them. Absolute nonsense. Of course he was going to need documentary evidence. Why didn't he have that to back up what he was saying? And I know, yes, it's going to take him longer than it should because he's releasing tidbits instead of the whole record. He should just be able to hand over his phone and go, get what you want. Obviously, he's not going to do that because there'll be plenty in there that would reflect poorly on him. He's not doing this to shine a spotlight on the truth. I know there's a lot of people who, are wanting Dominic Cummings to do the right thing and expose all of this, and they've suffered personally themselves. He's not going to do that. He's doing it for his own purposes. As such, the messages released are heavily curated. That takes time. He has to make sure he's only providing enough to cause damage where he wants it done. He doesn't want, for example, to release anything that's going to be damaging to him. And bear in mind, after the hearing, when he let Rishi Sunak, Michael Gove and Dominic Raab completely off the hook because he wants to get into their good books if one of those takes over, he doesn't want to release anything that would damage them either. Obviously, that takes time. But still, why weren't some of them at least released for his hearing date? And then, given that hearing date came and went, and it was obvious that the public and certainly Tory MPs trusted him even less than Matt Hancock, because that was the reality of it. Public polling showed it's like they'd rather believe Matt Hancock than Dominic Cummings. That's where we are. Why didn't he then release some of those messages before Hancock's hearing date? In fact, why didn't he release the ones he released yesterday? Why didn't he release those on the date of Hancock's hearing, just a few minutes before they were going in? That would have blindsided him completely. Bear in mind, Hancock wouldn't necessarily have been aware of the content of some of these messages because they were about him, but they weren't involving him. You know, obviously Boris Johnson didn't call Matt Hancock totally effing hopeless to his face, did it behind his back. Hancock may have known that there was some argy-bargy. He wouldn't necessarily have seen the content of these messages before we did. MPs on the committee quoting the Prime Minister as calling him totally effing hopeless would have been a good device for throwing the Health Secretary off and perhaps getting some more interesting responses for him. Matt Hancock is probably one of the sharper members of the Cabinet. That's not setting a high bar there, of course. But, when you consider the members of the Cabinet, he's one of the better ones. But I doubt he's quick-witted enough to have calmly got through a session against some of this stuff. But Cummings didn't release it then. Why not? Has he lost control of the situation and he's only firing out these randomly damaging statements in the hope that just something will eventually stick? That he doesn't want to actually release a lot of stuff because he doesn't want to lose control over what he has? Is he just trying to do it with the bare minimum? Is he trying to be efficient? And is he just, it's not having the desired effect, so he throws a few more out? Or is there reasoning behind this? Did he think the timing of this coming after the hearings, including Hancock's, but before the report would be published, would be best? Did he want it to be released in such a way that the committee couldn't hear evidence against it, that there couldn't be a counter to it? The tweet following that message gave me another little clue, potentially. See if I'm reading too much into that. So there was a tweet following that message about Johnson calling his health secretary hopeless. And it was one containing some questions. So Dominic Cummings entitled the next tweet, it was a graphic, "A few simple questions to ask the PM." Should have there. And I'll tell you what I noticed. There were 6 questions. Now, this straight away, I thought to myself, hang on a minute. He's released these tweets yesterday morning, a little bit before Prime Minister's questions, and he had 6 questions he thought the Prime Minister should be asked. 6. The leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, gets 6 questions to put to Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's questions. Cummings released these damaging statements and then 6 questions that other people, unnamed people, should ask the Prime Minister just before PMQs. Was this Cummings trying to tell Starmer, ask these questions? If so, then I'm going to have to move my opinion towards the notion of Cummings having completely lost control of the situation and not really knowing what he's doing. At which point, I think we can abandon all hope that he's actually going to be useful in the long term here. Because first of all, given that the purpose of the hearing for him, not for the committee, but for him, was to damage Johnson and get him replaced, he spent his time in that hearing savaging Matt Hancock out of personal enmity. So I thought already he'd completely lost the plot. You went there to bring Boris Johnson down. You actually ended up just going for Matt Hancock, like a rabid dog. Secondly, he doesn't release the documentary proof of some of his statements when he knows not doing so will give Hancock an easy ride in his hearing, which is what happened. Hancock emerged from his questioning relatively unscathed. Like I said, the committee has Conservative MPs who have not been impressed with the government's handling of the pandemic, but it is still a committee mainly of Conservative MPs who would rather side with their own than with Dominic Cummings. Cummings needed to provide proof, and he failed to do so. And he has the proof, he's just not releasing it. Then he drops a couple of bombshells. Not on the day of Hancock's hearing, when they would absolutely derail his planned responses, because Matt Hancock will have gone in there with a plan. He'll have been advised, he'll have been briefed on what to say. Hancock would have been caught off guard. But he's released this just before PMQs with 6 questions, which strongly suggests to me that Cummings thought that Starmer would take his advice. Now, here's the thing. For anyone in Labour, Absolutely, we'd love it if Cummings handed over a load of documents that sinks any of the Tories responsible for where we are as a country now. But we don't trust him. We don't believe he's a reformed character. He's just one manipulative arsehole trying pretty badly at the moment to take out other manipulative arseholes. For Dominic Cummings, it could be seen as best like this. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's it. Starmer will happily, I've no doubt, use anything of interest that emerges, but he's not going to be taking his lead from Cummings into how to question him. It would be incredible conceit to think otherwise. Or were these questions intended for, say, journalists to ask? Is the fact that there are 6 of them purely a coincidence? After all, Starmer couldn't actually ask these questions as they are in their form, because 2 of them involve accusing MPs of lying, which you are not allowed to do in the House. And I know, it's bizarre that you are allowed to lie in the House without consequence, but not to accuse someone of lying. But bear in mind, we have a system that makes sense when MPs have at least a basic sense of respect for Parliament. It only falls down when they don't. So the bottom line is that Cummings has potentially poked further a relationship between Hancock and Johnson. You know, so that may emerge from this. That may be something that has genuine impact. Because if Hancock didn't know it at the time, he now knows that the Prime Minister thought he was hopeless and that he'd seriously considered sacking him. Now, there are 2 things to consider there. One, like I've already said, Hancock is actually one of the more able ministers. Yes, I know his department made a complete mess of the pandemic, but very little of that was down to actual incompetence. You know, not giving PPE contracts to PPE suppliers, but instead giving them to friends and donors with no experience in the sector. That's not incompetence, that's corruption. That's deliberate. You know, Dido Harding, who made a right arse of test and trace. Again, that wasn't incompetence on Matt Hancock's part, that was cronyism. Again, that was deliberate corruption. He didn't necessarily realise she'd be as crap as she was, but he deliberately didn't appoint someone who would be competent. He didn't prioritise competence over cronyism. That was deliberate. My point is that Hancock has made a mess of the situation because effectively he was told to. If he was part of a government that actually wanted to deal with this pandemic properly, we'd probably be applauding him for having done a good job. You know, so he will, if he has any sort of ego, and I've no doubt he will, be quite resentful of the fact that his boss has described him as totally hopeless when, as far as he's concerned, he is working within the guidelines set for him. He was just doing what he was told to do. And then the second point is that Boris Johnson, in the middle of a global pandemic that has cost us a heavy toll in lives, kept in place a health secretary that he himself, not just us, he himself was happy to consider totally hopeless. With 3 little words, one of them not really repeatable, Boris Johnson has proven that he did not, on any level, do his best. And if there's got to be any damage from what Cummings has said so far, that is probably it. Unless he releases some more things, which he's promised to do. But he keeps promising these things and he releases a little tiny thing that's like, well, it's limited. But what damage can these do? It may cause them another wobble in the polls as things stand now, but Cummings helped shape a government that simply lies big and brazens everything out. And they'll brazen this out. The greatest achievement of Dominic Cummings is to create an environment where nobody takes Dominic Cummings seriously, even when he's got proof of what he says. Which is probably a fairly annoying situation for him as well. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.